The air above Culver City, California, was thick with the heat of July in 1946. On the private runway of the Hughes Aircraft Company, a machine of singular ambition sat ready to defy the limits of aeronautical engineering. This was the XF-11, a reconnaissance prototype designed to fly higher, faster, and farther than any aircraft in the American arsenal. It was a physical manifestation of the will of its creator, Howard Robard Hughes, Jr., a man who recognized no boundary between his own body and the machines he built. The XF-11 was a beast of aluminum and magnesium, boasting a wingspan of over 101 feet and powered by two Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp major engines. These were the most powerful piston engines ever built, massive 28-cylinder radial power plants capable of generating 3,000 horsepower each. But the true innovation and the hidden danger lay in the propulsion delivery. Each engine drove a pair of contra-rotating propellers, two sets of 4 blades spinning in opposite directions on the same shaft to eliminate torque and maximize thrust. It was a design of theoretical perfection and mechanical complexity. Howard Hughes, dressed in his trademark fedora and a simple suit, walked around the aircraft with the critical eye of an engineer who trusted no one's calculations but his own. At 40 years old, he was already a legend, a film producer who had spent millions to capture authentic aerial combat in Hell's Angels, and an aviator who had circled the globe in record time. But on this Sunday, July 7th, he was not just the CEO, he was the test pilot. Despite the protests of the military, who preferred their own standardized test pilots, Hughes insisted on taking the controls for the maiden flight. He viewed the plane as his personal property, a mindset that would soon have catastrophic consequences. The flight plan was filed for a conservative 45 minutes, a standard shakedown cruise to test the systems and return. However, Hughes made a last-minute command that altered the physics of the flight. He ordered the ground crew to load 1,200 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel, double the recommended amount for a short test. This added thousands of pounds of unnecessary weight to the experimental craft, a decision driven perhaps by a desire to fly longer or simply by a refusal to be constrained by protocols. At 3:20 p.m., the massive Wasp majors roared to life. The sound was a deafening, chest-vibrating thrum that signaled the raw power at Hughes's fingertips. He taxied to the runway, the contra-rotating blades slicing the hot air. As he pushed the throttles forward, the XF-11 surged, lifting off the tarmac with an aggressive grace. Almost immediately, Hughes broke protocol again. He retracted the landing gear moments after takeoff. Standard procedure for a first flight dictated leaving the gear down to ensure stability and to have a safety net in case of hydraulic failure. Hughes, obsessed with speed and aerodynamic purity, wanted the aircraft clean. For over an hour, the flight was a triumph. Hughes cruised over Los Angeles, the city a sprawling grid beneath his wings. He tested the ailerons, the climb rate, and the instrumentation, radioing back data to the engineers on the ground. The aircraft performed beautifully, a testament to his vision. He flew past the 45-minute mark, consuming the extra fuel he had demanded, pushing the prototype into the unknown. Then, at 5:20 p.m., the physics of the afternoon shifted violently. The XF-11 was near the Los Angeles Country Club when a seal in the right engine's propeller hub failed. The hydraulic fluid, essential for maintaining the angle of the propeller blades, leaked out. The rear set of blades on the right engine instantly reversed their pitch. In aviation, pitch is everything. Positive pitch bites the air to pull the plane forward. Reverse pitch acts as an air brake. The right engine went from producing 3,000 horsepower of thrust to producing a massive wall of drag. The aircraft yawed violently to the right, the nose swinging as if struck by a giant hand. Hughes was thrown against his restraints, the control yoke fighting him with the force of a living thing. Disoriented, Hughes misdiagnosed the failure. He believed the drag was caused by a landing gear door falling open or a flap malfunction. He did not feather the right propeller. a procedure that would have turned the blades edge on to the wind and reduced the drag. Instead, he applied full power, trying to climb out of the descent. It was a fatal error. Adding power to the reversed propeller only increased the drag, pulling the right wing down harder. The XF-11 began a sickening, shuddering slide toward the rooftops of Beverly Hills. The descent was not a glide. It was a fall with forward momentum. The heavy fuel load, the very fuel Hughes had insisted upon, now worked against him, robbing the aircraft of the lift it desperately needed to clear the obstacles rising to meet it. Hughes fought the controls with desperate strength, his eyes scanning the terrain for a clearing. He aimed for the green expanse of the Los Angeles Country Club golf course, a strip of salvation in a sea of residential development. He was too low. The right wingtip of the XF-11, spanning over 50 feet from the fuselage, clipped the red tile roof of a home on North Whittier Drive. The impact was the sound of a thunderclap made of metal and wood. The wing sheared through the upper story of the house, the aluminum structure tearing apart. The collision robbed the aircraft of its remaining stability. The XF-11 cartwheeled through the air, a broken bird of prey spinning out of control. The fuselage, carrying the pilot and the volatile fuel, slammed into a second house, demolishing the structure in a shower of stucco and glass. The violence of the movement stripped the wings entirely from the body of the plane. The central cockpit section, now a ballistic missile of crumpled steel, skidded across a manicured lawn and crashed into the garage of 806 North Whittier Drive. The world went silent for a heartbeat. Then the fuel tanks ruptured. A fireball erupted, a column of orange and black that punched into the summer sky. The heat was instantaneous, a thermal shockwave that shattered windows across the street. The garage was consumed. Inside the wreckage, Howard Hughes was pinned in the pilot's seat. The instrument panel had been driven into his chest, crushing his ribs and collapsing his left lung. His collarbone was snapped, his skull fractured. The flames began to lick at the cockpit, the heat searing his skin. In the chaos, a figure ran toward the inferno. Marine Technical Sergeant William Lloyd Durkin was visiting friends nearby when the ground shook. Conditioned by war to run toward the sound of disaster, Durkin vaulted fences and sprinted through the smoke. He arrived to find a scene from hell, a burning pile of debris that had once been the world's most advanced aircraft. Durkin climbed onto the burning wing root. The heat was intense enough to singe his eyebrows. Through the shattered canopy he saw the pilot, a man he did not recognize as the famous billionaire, but simply a human being burning alive. Hughes was conscious but delirious, struggling feebly against the metal trap of the cockpit. Durkin reached in, grabbing Hughes by his shirt and arms. With a heave of adrenaline-fueled strength, he pulled the broken aviator up through the flames. Another bystander, Captain James Guston, rushed to assist. Together they dragged Hughes off the wing and onto the grass, moments before the main fuel reserves detonated, vaporizing the cockpit where Hughes had been seconds before. Hughes lay on the grass, his clothes burned away, his body a map of trauma. He was gasping for air, each breath a battle against his collapsed lung. He was lucid enough to give his name, but his voice was a wet rasp. The sirens were screaming in the distance, getting louder. The pain was absolute, a white-hot universe of agony that would define the rest of his life. He looked up at the sky, now obscured by the smoke of his own ambition. The survival of Howard Hughes was a medical miracle, but the man who emerged from the ashes of North Whittier Drive was fundamentally changed. The physical recovery was grueling, but the psychological scars were far deeper and more permanent. During his convalescence, Hughes was administered high doses of morphine and codeine to manage the excruciating pain of his burns and crushed skeleton. The relief these drugs provided became a necessity, then a crutch, and finally a prison. As the years passed, the trauma of the crash, the sensation of burning, the vulnerability of the flesh, metastasized into a pathological terror of the outside world. The brilliant engineer who had designed the XF-11, began to apply his analytical mind to a new, invisible enemy: germs. Hughes retreated into a world of his own design, a fortress of solitude constructed to keep contamination at bay. He began to view human touch not as a source of comfort, but as a vector for disease. His behavior, once dismissed as the eccentricity of a genius, hardened into the rigid rituals of severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. He established germ-free zones in his living quarters. These were darkened sanctuaries where the windows were sealed with masking tape to prevent unfiltered air from entering. He spent his days naked or wearing only a drawstring bag, convinced that clothing trapped germs against his skin. The man who had courted Hollywood's most beautiful women now forbade anyone from looking at him or touching him directly. His instructions to his staff, a group of loyal aides, became complex technical manuals for daily living. The simple act of handing him a spoon involved a multi-step protocol. The handle of the utensil had to be wrapped in tissue paper, specifically multiple layers of Kleenex. The aide's fingers could never touch the metal that would touch the tissue that would touch Hughes. If the tissue slipped, the spoon was contaminated and had to be discarded. Opening a can of peaches was treated with the same seriousness as an engine overhaul. Hughes wrote a memo detailing how the label must be soaked off, the metal scrubbed to a shine, washed again, and the contents poured into a bowl without the external surface of the can ever making contact with the ceramic. Yet, in a tragic paradox common to his condition, his personal hygiene deteriorated as his fear of external germs increased. He stopped bathing, fearing the water itself. He refused to brush his teeth, leading to severe dental decay. Most disturbingly, he stopped cutting his nails. His fingernails grew into long, twisting spirals that curled in on themselves. His toenails became thick, yellow horns. The pain of walking on them forced him to abandon shoes. Instead, he would sometimes shuffle to the bathroom wearing empty Kleenex boxes on his feet as protective slippers. In these darkened rooms, surrounded by stacks of unread newspapers and jars of his own urine which he refused to let staff remove, Hughes managed his empire by telephone. He was a phantom voice on the line, buying and selling companies, while physically he was rotting away. To numb the pain of his old injuries and the new agony of his condition, he injected codeine intramuscularly. He used glass syringes, often breaking the needles off in his own hardened flesh, leaving metal fragments embedded in his arms, shrapnel from a war he was fighting against himself. In the winter of 1966, the Phantom decided to move. Under the cover of darkness, Howard Hughes arrived in Las Vegas aboard a private train car. He was transported by stretcher to the Desert Inn, entering through a service elevator to the penthouse on the 9th floor. He had come for a few weeks of rest, but when the hotel management asked him to vacate the suite for high-rolling guests over the new year, Hughes simply bought the hotel. The purchase of the Desert Inn for $13.2 million was the opening move in a campaign that would transform Las Vegas. Hughes, from his sealed penthouse, realized that in this city, money was the only law. He began an acquisition spree that was unprecedented in American business history. He bought the Sands, the Frontier, the Castaways, the Landmark, and the Silver Slipper. He became the largest employer in Nevada, the unseen emperor of the Strip. His reasons for buying were often as eccentric as his lifestyle. The Silver Slipper Casino, located across the street from the Desert Inn, featured a massive rotating neon sign in the shape of a high-heeled shoe. The flashing lights from the sign irritated Hughes, penetrating the blackout curtains of his bedroom. When the owners refused to turn it off, he bought the casino and ordered the mechanism dismantled. The slipper stopped spinning, and the billionaire could sleep. His insomnia, fueled by his drug use and irregular sleeping patterns, led to another legendary purchase. Frustrated that local television stations signed off after the late news, leaving him with nothing to watch in the dead of night, Hughes bought KLAS-TV, the local CBS affiliate. He turned it into the first 24-hour station in Las Vegas, treating it as his personal video jukebox. From his bed, Hughes would call the station manager and dictate the schedule. If he wanted to see a Western, Las Vegas watched a Western. If he fell asleep during a movie, he would call and order the station to rewind the reel. Confused viewers across the city would see scenes repeat or films switch abruptly, unaware that their programming was being controlled by the whims of a recluse in the desert inn penthouse. His favorite film was Ice Station Zebra, a Cold War thriller about a submarine mission in the Arctic. He watched it obsessively, reportedly over 150 times. The icy, sterile landscapes of the film perhaps offered a comforting contrast to the cluttered, stifling heat of his hotel room. Despite owning a massive chunk of the city, Hughes never stepped foot on the casino floors. He communicated with his chief executive, Robert Maheu, exclusively by memo and telephone. Maheu, a former FBI agent who ran Hughes's empire for years, fought his battles, and managed his billions, never once met Howard Hughes face to face. The billionaire existed only as a signature and a voice, a ghost haunting the machinery of capitalism. While Hughes was hiding from the world in Las Vegas, the U.S. government sought to use his legendary secrecy for one of the most audacious covert operations of the Cold War. In 1968, a Soviet ballistic missile submarine, the K-129, had sunk in the Pacific Ocean, 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. It lay at a crushing depth of 6,500 feet, over 3 miles down. The Soviets had failed to find it, but the Americans, using underwater listening arrays, knew exactly where it was. The CIA wanted the submarine. It contained nuclear missiles, code books, and cryptographic machines, an intelligence bonanza. But raising a 2,000-ton steel hulk from the abyssal plain without the Russians knowing was an engineering impossibility. They needed a cover story so elaborate that no one would question a massive ship loitering in the middle of the Pacific. They needed a crazy billionaire interested in deep-sea mining. The CIA approached the Hughes organization. They proposed Project Azorian. Hughes would lend his name and his companies to the project, claiming he was building a ship to harvest manganese nodules from the ocean floor. It was the perfect lie. It fit Hughes' profile of eccentric, futuristic investments perfectly. The ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, was a marvel of engineering. It was 619 feet long and featured a moon pool, a massive internal docking bay hidden behind sliding doors in the hull. The plan was to lower a giant mechanical claw on miles of pipe, grab the submarine, and lift it secretly into the belly of the ship. In the summer of 1974, the Glomar Explorer arrived at the site. The operation was a technical tightrope walk. The claw descended into the darkness, guided by cameras and sonar. It successfully grappled the K-129. The winches groaned as the lift began. For days, they hauled the prize up through the water column. But as the submarine neared the surface, the structural integrity of the claw failed. Under the immense strain, several grabber arms snapped. The submarine broke apart. The rear section, containing the missile control center and the code room, slipped back into the abyss. The Glomar Explorer recovered only the forward 38 feet of the vessel. Inside the recovered section were the bodies of 6 Soviet submariners. In a moment of profound respect amidst the espionage, the CIA agents gave them a formal burial at sea, filming the ceremony. They recovered some torpedoes and documents, but the primary target was lost. The operation might have remained secret forever if not for a bizarre twist back in Los Angeles. Thieves broke into the Hughes headquarters and stole a cache of documents, including a memo linking Hughes to the CIA and the Glomar Explorer. The story leaked. When the press came calling, the CIA issued the now famous Glomar response. We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of the details of the operation. Hughes, the man who shrank from the world, had once again facilitated a touch with history's deepest secrets, all while never leaving his darkened room. By April 1976, the walls of the fortress had become a tomb. Howard Hughes had moved from Las Vegas to the Bahamas, then to London, and finally to the Acapulco Princess Hotel in Mexico. He was seeking privacy and a steady supply of drugs, but his body had finally collapsed. Decades of phenacetin abuse, A compound found in the painkillers he consumed like candy had destroyed his kidneys. He was in total renal failure. He was dehydrated, malnourished, and drifting into a coma. On April 5, 1976, his aides made the decision to fly him to the Methodist Hospital in Houston. He was loaded onto a chartered Learjet, listed on the manifest as John T. Conover. The flight was a race against physiology that Hughes would not win. At 1:27 p.m., thousands of feet above the Mexican landscape, the heart of the aviator stopped. He was 70 years old. When the plane landed in Houston, the authorities were faced with a corpse that defied identification. The man on the stretcher weighed barely 90 pounds. His hair was long, gray, and matted. His beard was a thicket of neglect. His fingernails and toenails were long, spiraled claws. The FBI had to be called in to take fingerprints to confirm that this emaciated figure was indeed Howard Hughes. The autopsy revealed the physical toll of his mental prison. X-rays of his arms showed 5 broken hypodermic needles embedded in the muscle tissue, calcified remnants of the injections he had given himself to numb the pain. He had died of kidney failure, a long, slow suicide by neglect and addiction. But to understand this end, to understand the needles, the pain, and the darkness, we must return to the moment where the pain truly began. We must return to the grass on North Whittier Drive in 1946. The fire that had consumed the XF-11 had not consumed Howard Hughes, though it had tried. On that July evening, as the ambulance sped toward Good Samaritan Hospital, Hughes was not expected to survive the night. His doctors gave him zero chance. Yet, as he lay in the hospital bed, his body shattered. The engineer within him refused to die. The standard hospital bed was torture. The springs created pressure points on his severe burns. Even in his critical state, Hughes called for his design team. He instructed them to build a new kind of bed, a burn bed. He designed a grid of open straps and adjustable sections, driven by electric motors which allowed air to circulate freely around his damaged skin and distributed his weight to minimize pain. It was a prototype, like his planes, built to solve a problem that standard technology could not. He recovered in the bed he designed. Against all odds, he walked out of the hospital. He did not retire. He had one final point to prove. The government and the press were mocking his other massive project, the H-4 Hercules, a giant wooden flying boat they derisively called the Spruce Goose. They said it was too heavy, that it would never fly. On November 2, 1947, a year after the crash that ruined his body, Hughes sat in the cockpit of the Spruce Goose in Long Beach Harbor. He was in constant pain, his ribs grinding against each other, but his hands were steady. He pushed the 8 throttles forward. The massive wooden ship accelerated, the water churning white. And then it lifted. The Spruce Goose rose 70 feet into the air, flying for a mile over the harbor. It flew only once, but it was enough. It was the aviator's final defiant gesture against gravity and his critics. But the victory was a closing curtain, not a new beginning. The XF-11 crash had planted the seeds of his destruction. The pain from that day necessitated the morphine, which became the codeine. The horror of the burning cockpit birthed the fear of the world that would eventually lock him in the dark. The man who flew the largest plane in history would die unable to walk across a room. The aviator had survived the fall from the sky, but he could not survive the long, slow descent into the cage of his own mind.